How an invisible code shaped entire civilizations without spilling a single drop of blood. There's a power that built empires, toppled dynasties, and transformed entire nations without a single soldier ever marching. We're not talking about weapons, technology, or natural resources. We're talking about something far more subtle, far more devastating, an invisible code operating in the shadows of the human mind. And the most fascinating part, it's still working right now, this very moment, as you're watching this video. Let's dive into unexplored territory. For centuries, dominant civilizations discovered that true conquest doesn't happen on battlefields, but in the most valuable territory that exists, people's minds. Masters of this art understood that you don't need to destroy your adversaries when you can transform them into allies without them even noticing. It's a social alchemy so powerful that entire kingdoms changed hands through carefully constructed words, symbols, and narratives. Think about the Silk Road. It wasn't just a trade route, it was the greatest cultural influence project in ancient history. Persian merchants, for instance, weren't just selling spices and fabrics. They were selling ideas, philosophies, technologies, ways of seeing the world. Every transaction was an opportunity to plant mental seeds. Over time, distant peoples began adopting customs, beliefs, and even government systems from cultures that had never invaded their lands. The empire expanded through desire, not force. Now here's the disturbing part. The architects of this strategy knew something that modern neuroscience has only recently confirmed. The human brain is programmable, not in the literal sense, but through repetition, emotion, and association. When you control the stories people tell, you control how they think. And when you control how they think, you control how they act. It's high performance applied at civilizational scale. Look at the role of scribes in ancient Egypt. They weren't simple clerks. They were programmers of social reality. Through hieroglyphic writing, they determined what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. They controlled the official narrative, and whoever controls the narrative controls power. The pharaohs understood this deeply. That's why they invested more in scribes than in soldiers. The pen has always been mightier than the sword, but it took us millennia to publicly admit it. Here's the secret few people realize. You don't conquer people through imposition. You conquer through intellectual seduction. When someone believes an idea was theirs, that a choice was free, that a change was voluntary, you've reached the maximum level of influence. It's the difference between a prisoner and a disciple. The prisoner obeys out of fear. The disciple obeys out of conviction. And conviction is unshakable. Artificial intelligence is now decoding these ancient patterns with frightening precision. Algorithms can identify which narratives spread faster, which emotions generate more engagement, which words create more conversion. We're automating what used to be pure art. And this puts us at a historic crossroads. We can use this knowledge to build or destroy, to elevate or manipulate. The tool is neutral. The intention isn't. Think about modern marketing. It's the same ancient strategy, just accelerated. Major brands don't sell products. They sell identity, belonging, status. When you buy an iPhone, you're not buying a phone. You're buying entry into a tribe. You're declaring who you are. It's conquest without conflict. It's empire without physical territory. It's the ancient secret operating in binary code. If this is making you rethink everything you know about power and influence, hit that like button right now. And in the comments, write the word narrative. I want to know how many archaeologists are with me on this expedition. Why controlling minds was more efficient than controlling territories. Let's go deeper into the mechanism. There's a mathematical reason why influence beats brute force. When you conquer by the sword, you need to keep the sword forever. You need garrisons, supplies, constant surveillance. It's expensive, exhausting, unsustainable. But when you conquer through the mind, the population itself becomes guardian of the system. They defend their own chains because they don't even realize their chain. The ancient Greeks mastered this through philosophy. Athens was never the greatest military empire, but it spread its influence through ideas. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates created mental frameworks that shaped Western thought for over 2,000 years. Rome conquered militarily, but was culturally conquered by Greece. Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror, wrote Horace. It's definitive proof. Ideas are more resilient than legions. Now, observe a fascinating pattern in history. All great civilizational transformations began with a narrative shift, not with an armed revolution. The Protestant Reformation started with 95 theses nailed to a door. It wasn't an invasion, it was an intellectual challenge. But it shook the foundations of Europe, redistributed power, redefined borders. Martin Luther, armed with ideas, was more disruptive than any army of his time. Think about Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. That wasn't just a technological innovation. It was a weapon of mass destruction of the informational monopoly. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer an elite privilege. Any literate person could access texts, form opinions, question authorities. Gutenberg's genius wasn't in the machine. It was an understanding that democratizing information is democratizing power, and that changes absolutely everything. Today, artificial intelligence is doing something similar, but exponentially faster. Language models can create personalized narratives for each individual. Imagine having an Egyptian scribe dedicated exclusively to you, crafting messages that resonate perfectly with your values, fears, desires. This already exists. It's called algorithmic marketing, and it's redefining how civilizations think collectively. See how high performance works in this context. It's not about working harder, it's about working on the right leverage points. If you want to transform a society, you don't need to convince everyone. You need to convince the opinion multipliers, influencers, in modern jargon. But this concept is thousands of years old. There have always been people who amplify messages. Conquering these people means conquering entire networks. Medieval copyist monks knew this. They spent entire lifetimes transcribing manuscripts by hand. It seems like manual labor, but it was strategic. They chose which texts to preserve, which to ignore, which to subtly modify. They were curators of collective memory, and curators are cultural architects. They didn't just record history, they actively created it. Through their choices, here's the fundamental principle: repetition creates reality. Not objective reality, but perceived reality. And perceived reality is the only one that matters for human behavior. If you can make something be repeated enough times, in sufficiently varied contexts, by sufficiently credible sources, it becomes functional truth. This is how myths become facts. This is how brands become necessities. This is how ideas become empires. The discipline here isn't military, it's mental. It requires patience. It requires consistency. It requires deep understanding of how information propagates through social networks, in the broadest sense of the term. Each person is a node in a gigantic network. Activating the right nodes in the right sequence creates cascades of change. It's complexity science applied to cultural conquest. If you're starting to see the world through different eyes, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We need more awakened people for this archaeology of power. Comment leverage. If you got the code. How technology transformed an ancient whisper into global fun. Now, we reach the historic inflection point. For millennia, this secret was the privilege of a few: priests, scribes, royal advisors, elite diplomats. They guarded the knowledge jealously because they understood that knowledge is power, and shared power is diluted power. But something changed radically in the last 50 years. The democratization of technology exploded this monopoly irreversibly. The internet did in decades what the printing press took centuries to do. It transformed every person into a potential creator of narratives. You no longer need an army of scribes. You no longer need industrial printing presses. You no longer need television networks. You need a smartphone and an idea that resonates. This is simultaneously liberating and terrifying because it democratizes both good and evil. Think about recent social movements: Arab Spring, global protests, massive cultural changes. None of them started with tanks or bombs. They started with hashtags, viral videos, coordinated messages. They're the ancient patterns of influence operating at digital speed. What used to take generations now happens in weeks. We're witnessing territorial conquest without physical maps. The territory is human attention. And here's where artificial intelligence enters as the ultimate multiplier. Imagine having the ability to analyze billions of conversations, identify emotional patterns, predict which messages will resonate with which demographic groups, and then automate the creation of those messages. It's not science fiction, it's operational reality. Governments use it, corporations use it, social movements use it. The question isn't whether it will be used, but how and for what purpose. Look at the Cambridge Analytica case. Regardless of ethical controversies, they proved a concept. With enough data and adequate predictive models, you can influence decisions on a national scale, not necessarily through lies, but through true messages delivered at the right time, to the right people, in the right way. It's surgical precision applied to collective behavior change. Now think about the possibilities for those seeking personal high performance. You can use AI to understand which arguments work best in negotiations. You can analyze language patterns of historical leaders and incorporate those patterns. You can create personalized learning systems that adapt to your pace, your gaps, your goals. It's like having all the masters of history as virtual mentors. The necessary mindset here is that of a reverse engineer of influence. You study historical cases not out of academic curiosity, but to extract applicable principles. Phoenician traders dominated the Mediterranean through trust networks. How do you build trust networks today? Venetian diplomats maintain state secrets through primitive encryption. How do you protect valuable information in the digital age? It's a bridge between eras. What separates those who use these tools for construction versus manipulation? Intention and transparency. When you use influence to elevate, educate, empower, you're on the path of true performance. When you use it to deceive, exploit, dominate, you're building castles in the sand. They may impress temporarily, but they crumble under their own ethical weight. History is merciless with manipulators. Remember that. There's an important philosophical principle here, coming from the Stoics. Real power isn't in controlling others, but in controlling yourself. The greatest conquest isn't external, it's internal. When you master your reactions, your emotions, your internal narratives, you become unconquerable. No external empire matters if you're a slave to your own impulses. This is high performance in its purest essence. If this video is expanding your strategic vision, it now and comment mental empire. And if you have someone who needs to hear this, share it. Let's spread knowledge, not manipulation. What if you could apply these ancient codes right now? Let's get to what really matters. Practical application. You don't need to lead nations to use these principles. Every human interaction is a microcosm of power and influence dynamics. Every negotiation, every presentation, every difficult conversation, every relationship. The patterns are fractal. What works at imperial scale works at personal scale. You just need to learn the language. First applicable principle. Control the narrative before others control it for you. In your career, in your company, in your personal brand. If you don't define who you are, others will, and rarely favorably. The great negotiators of Venetian history knew this. Before any important negotiation, they planted strategic information that shaped perceptions. They didn't lie, but directed attention to their strengths. How do you do this today? Create consistent content that demonstrates expertise. Not random content, but coherent narrative that reinforces your positioning. Use artificial intelligence to optimize your messages. Tools like GPT can analyze your communication and suggest improvements based on high-performance patterns. It's like having a rhetoric consultant available 24 hours. Use this without shame. Your competitors are using it. Second principle, identify multipliers. You don't need to convince masses. You need to convince the right people, who naturally influence others. In any organization, there are connectors, people who know many people, who are respected, whose opinions echo. Invest time in them, not in a manipulative way, but authentically. Genuine relationships with multipliers are worth more than 1,000 superficial contacts. It's relational efficiency. Ancient Persian ambassadors mastered this. They spent years cultivating relationships in foreign courts. They didn't pressure, didn't force. They were just present, offered value, built trust gradually. When they finally needed something, the request was almost a formality. The foundation was already solidified. Strategic patience beats tactical anxiety. Always. Third principle, use intelligent repetition. It's not about being annoying. It's about reinforcing key messages through different formats, varied contexts, strategic moments. Prophets of all religions knew this. Same core message, 1,000 different parables. Each one reached a different type of listener. You can do the same with your ideas, your products, your proposals. Vary the packaging, keep the essence. Artificial intelligence can help enormously here. Sentiment analysis tools identify which versions of your message generate more engagement. You can test narratives on a small scale before launching larger campaigns. It's scientific method applied to communication. Hypothesis, test, analysis, refinement. Alchemists sought to transform lead into gold through experiments. You can transform common ideas into movements through systematic testing. Fourth principle, never stop studying. Masters of this art were perpetual students of human behavior. They read philosophy, studied history, observed patterns. You have an advantage they never had: instant access to all human knowledge. Library of Alexandria in your pocket. The question isn't availability of information, it's curation and application. Be relentless about this. Create your own high-performance system based on these ancient codes. Don't copy blindly. Adapt to your context, your values, your goals. The secret was never a rigid formula. It was always an approach, deeply understanding how humans think, feel, decide, and then designing strategies that work with human nature, not against it. This is ancient wisdom finding contemporary application. It's you becoming architect of your own reality. If you made it this far, you're different. You seek real depth. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment. Architect. Our expedition is just beginning. There's so much more to unearth. See you in the next video.